personally believe that distributed systems make a system potentially more resilient. But let me start with my favorite example, which is phantom traffic jams. So if you look at this, you would think it's not difficult to drive in a circle, but as it turns out, after some time, traffic flow breaks down and we have a traffic jam with no reason. Now the question is, why is this happening and what can we do about it? Actually, there are models in order to understand what's going on there, and it turns out that traffic flow is unstable above a certain critical density. And it means that basically when the distances between cars are too short, there's an overreaction to small variations in speeds, and that means everyone tips the brake a little bit harder, and the next one even harder, and so on. That causes a chain reaction, and finally cars stop even though drivers don't want this to happen. So instability of systems is important, and important to avoid, in fact. And there are a number of measures that engineers have thought about in order to avoid these traffic instabilities and the breakdowns that would lead to traffic jams. So they've built expensive traffic control centers, and they came up with telematic concepts. So these control centers basically changed variable message signs. They have introduced variable speed limits and on-ramp control. It means traffic lights controlling the number of vehicles getting on the freeway and all these kind of things. But these measures haven't been extremely effective. We are now going in the recent years actually into a different kind of traffic control, which is distributed control, where you have vehicles talking to each other, and that allows them to coordinate each other better. And here is actually a model that allows you to understand how we can modify the interaction of cars in such a way that it would avoid traffic jams. So here's some equations that are showing you how vehicles drive. So first of all, there's an equation of motion for vehicle alpha. Basically says that change in location is given by the speed. And that's the acceleration equation that defines how the speed changes in time. It shows you that there's a desired speed, say the speed limit, and then basically the deceleration depends on the distance between vehicles, on the speed of the vehicle, on relative velocity, and there's basically a desired distance that depends on these quantities. Now, as you can see, there are a number of parameters in these equations, in particular acceleration A, deceleration B, a time gap, and these parameters can be changed actually by adaptive cruise control systems. So 10 years ago, at the time when nobody was talking about self-driving cars at Google, we've been working with Volkswagen and other companies on these driver assistance systems. And in fact, depending on the location with regard to the traffic jam, we changed driving parameters. So what we had basically is a system that measured distances and relative velocities using radar sensors. And based on this information, we had the cars drive automatically. And as you can see over here, there is a range, in particular, basically the downstream front of the traffic jam, where we dramatically change some of the parameters. Namely, we are reducing the time gap, I mean the separation between cars, somewhat, and we are increasing the acceleration. Now, reducing the time gap increases capacity, but at the same time it destabilizes traffic flow even more. In order to compensate for this, we need to have higher acceleration. But with this, we can actually change the interaction of cars. That's what we call mechanism design. And we can get rid of this annoying stop-and-go traffic that we're now simulating to show you that we can actually reproduce traffic jams realistically. Now, in order to really see what's the reason for these annoying traffic jams, we will elevate ourselves out of this car. So, before the times when drones were invented, we had made this video, and you can see that vehicles are trying to get on the freeway, and this produces small perturbations of the flow. These small perturbations are amplified, causes the stop-and-go traffic that we want to get rid of. And then at a certain point in time, we turn on this driver assistance system. As we'll see, after a short time, the traffic jams go away. Now this is interesting because we haven't engaged here into a centralized control concept where there's a traffic center that controls every single car. Now we had a distributed control concept where each car was changing its behavior a little bit, and this is what changed the macroscopic outcome. So changing the micro interactions allows us to get a different macro outcome. The interesting point, moreover, is that we don't need to equip 100% of vehicles with this system. Even if we had just 20, 30, 40% of vehicles equipped with these adaptive cruise control systems, that would have dramatic impacts on traffic flow in a positive way and reduce congestion really largely. So this is kind of surprising, that just a few cars need to change their behavior and you have an overall effect that everyone benefits from. Now the question is, can we apply the same kind of approach to social systems? In fact, in a sense, we have similar problems in social systems. And social dilemma situations are situations where the desirable state is unstable too. Before, the desirable state was free traffic flow, but it broke down because it was unstable. This time, the desirable state is cooperation. If everyone cooperates, that would be good for everyone. But it's usually not stable in these social dilemma situations. That's why it breaks down. We call the outcome a tragedy of the commons. As you can see over here, there are basically no trees on one side of the border. On the other side, there are trees. That shows you already there must be a way actually to avoid a tragedy of the commons. Now in my talk, I'm going to address a number of questions, some relating to behavioral conventions, in this case side references of pedestrians. That's reducing the friction in the crowd, so it makes the motion more fluid, more efficient. We're going to talk about cooperation and conditions that are supporting cooperation, and we're talking about the emergence of moral behavior, and finally also why are we social and what causes social norms. Let me start here with a short and very incomplete history of socio-cultural evolution. And in fact, since the very beginning of humankind, humans have been confronted with cooperation problems. One of these problems is called the stag hunt game. So people had to hunt animals in order to find enough food for them. But they could hunt individually and would walk home with a rabbit, or they could hunt together, and this way maybe even manage to hunt a mammoth. So obviously that requires collaboration, and the other very famous game that people have studied at large, is the public goods game, where people are creating a common good together. There are some cooperators that make a contribution to this common good, but everyone benefits from this. And that creates incentives for free riders not to contribute, because they would get the benefit without having to invest. Obviously, that creates incentives not to cooperate, and that's why we would often end up with the tragedy of the commons, such as environmental pollution, or overfishing, or climate change. To mention just a few examples, tax evasion would be another one, free riding on public transport another one, and we're all familiar with these problems, and as they're all around us, it shows that we have not been fully successful in terms of overcoming these problems. But since the early times of human history, there were mechanisms that people used or invented that allowed them to create cooperation in these kind of situations. And for example, we had family clans. And in some areas of our world, this is still very important today. In Europe, it was more important in history, so we had dynasties there too. And the problem, however, is that there are some side effects of this. We'll see that one side effect is basically blood revenge, the other one is ethnic conflicts. And talking about conflict, here is another mechanism that's really very old. You know it from the Bible, the Old Testament. Eye for eye and tooth for tooth. So that's, in a sense, the invention of peer punishment, one could say. And there are experiments that have been done quite recently to show the effectiveness of this. So if you play a public goods game with no punishment, then your level of cooperation would drop. And if you start punishing, then the level of cooperation would go up. So I'm sure the subject will come up several times during our law course. And many people have implied that actually war would be the mother of culture, and I'm not so sure about this actually. What we can certainly state is that human migration has played an important role for the spreading and evolution of culture, not only for the spreading, but also when two cultures meet, new ideas are born, so basically culture evolves. But we need to be aware that, first of all, in order to live together in social groups, it's important that people are not too aggressive. And in fact, there is a mechanism that we know also from epidemics, that in the beginning viruses or bacteria are more deadly than later on, because they depend on us to spread them. So if they're not too aggressive to the host, I mean, let us stay alive, then we can help them more to spread them, and that makes them less aggressive. And a similar thing has happened actually among humans, that became less aggressive over time. Now, if you want to live together, then apparently you would need to know that while you're sleeping, somebody else wouldn't kill you. And so having a sufficiently low level of aggression is a precondition for living together. Then in the beginning we know that people were hunters and gatherers, because food accumulation was not very efficient. So once the food was depleted in one area, you had to go to another area. But eventually people learned agriculture and animal farming. And the advantage of this was that they didn't have to move on all the time, but they could stay in a place, and with this they could start to accumulate stuff. Food, for example, for bad times. And accumulation, of course, is the precondition for all the further cultural evolution that we've seen. Now, once you live in communities, of course, we start imitating successful behaviors, and maybe also some other behaviors that are not necessarily so successful, but imitation speeds up learning, right? If we just imagine we would have to learn everything that somebody in the history of humankind has learned, we had to learn that by ourselves. It would take hundreds or thousands of years. So it's really important that we imitate successes of others. And that brings us actually to some equations that allow us to understand how successful behaviors spread. So as you can see over here, we have an equation that shows how the proportion of people showing behavior I in subpopulation A changes with time. And so apparently people with other behaviors could change to behavior I. There's a certain transition rate. And it could also happen that people who before showed behavior I would change to behavior I prime, some other behavior. So we would have to sum up over all the other behaviors. And the overall change is given by inflow into I minus outflow from I. And what we then have to do with this master equation is to specify the transition rates. And here I have made an assumption that there is a certain probability of changing from I to I prime. And these transitions could be of spontaneous nature, they could be induced by others. So we could have imitation or avoidance behavior, and because the relative proportion of these behaviors appears 2 times in this equation here and over there, this is something like a Boltzmann-like equation where P appears in a quadratic way, and that describes interactions. Now, if we just focus on imitation processes and assume that the transition probability is positive if the expected success would increase and otherwise we wouldn't change the behavior, then eventually you get this famous replicator equation. And if you know a little bit about evolutionary biology, then you know this is the equation that describes the evolution of species, in particular how fitness changes in time, here expected success. And it turns out that actually fitness increases proportional to the variation of fitness. So variability, that means diversity, is really important. And in fact, as agglomerations grow, we don't just have a situation where people interact repeatedly and need to remember whom they have interacted with. So that would create something like direct reciprocity. You help me, I help you. Something like friendship relationships. But we'd also see that there would be a specialization and differentiation process, and that creates the basis for economic markets. And in fact, eventually people were starting to trade with strangers, and so we know this famous study of the Kula by Rolf Ziegler, which is exactly about this. But in the beginning, this was a barter economy. So you had one good, other people had other goods, and we were changing goods for other goods. Apparently this was very inefficient because you had to find somebody who wanted your good and had something you were interested in. So eventually people invented money. And now you didn't have to find some other person that was interested in your goods and you were interested in their goods. You were just giving money for the goods that you wanted, and that person could then exchange the money for something that person wanted. So with this intermediary of money, that created something like indirect reciprocity in economic systems. And apparently we have that in social systems too. So if I don't only help those who help me, but I help others because I'm friendly, and others are friendly too, somebody else will be friendly to me one day. And so I benefit from this. Everyone benefits if you're friendly. Of course, if some people are friendly and others aren't friendly, then that creates possibility to exploit friendly people. And to avoid this, we need to have mechanisms again, and one such mechanism is reputation. Besides all these mechanisms that I've been talking about, which are decentralized mechanisms, people have invented also centralized institutions such as courts and pool punishment and schooling, accumulation of scientific knowledge. And so all of this has been important for the evolution of culture. Let's get a bit more scientific and formal now. Let's talk about evolutionary game theory. And let's start with coordination and cooperation. To make it short, because Heinrich has introduced it to you already, game theory is a theory of interactive decision-making. And one of these situations is a situation of pedestrians having to evade each other. So assume two pedestrians are standing in front of each other, want to walk in opposite directions, so they have to walk around each other. And they can either go to the right or they can go to the left. Now, if both go to the right, then apparently they succeed evading each other, and that creates a benefit B. They're successful, but if one goes to the right and the other one goes to the left, then they're still standing in front of each other. They haven't been successful, and that gives a payoff of 0. Same thing, if both go to the left, there's a benefit, and this defined as basically a payoff matrix of this kind of interaction. So if both pedestrians do the same thing, coordinate each other on one kind of behavior, and they're successful and they get a payoff, otherwise not. Now we can insert this payoff matrix actually in the replicator equation, or we can actually use the equation that I have introduced to you before. And what we then get after a number of calculations is this simple equation over here. And as you can see, that has 3 stationary solutions. The stationary solution is defined by the change of the proportion of people showing behavior I with time being set to 0. So when this is 0, there's no change, and that happens if p equals 1/2. That means if there's a 50-50 situation, 50% of people go to the left, 50% of people go to the right. But there's also a stationary solution for p equals 1 or p equals 0. That means everyone going to the right or everyone going to the left. Now the interesting point is that p equals 1/2 is the solution that we would expect, If there's nobody who tells you what you should do, well, you would think people do one thing 50% of cases and the other thing again 50% of time. However, that turns out to be an unstable stationary solution, because it's inefficient, as we have seen before, right? It's not leading to a great success, on the contrary. So the slightest deviation from the 50-50 situation by chance will drive your system either into this solution or that stationary solution, and both of them are stable. So you get towards a situation where everyone finally does the same thing. A behavioral convention is being created. And that makes your pedestrian counterflow efficient. So behavioral conventions, apparently, are one social mechanism to make things more efficient, and eventually they turn into norms sometimes too. But there's some more complicated situations to deal with, which are not of the kind of coordination problems, but cooperation problems. And here we just change the entries of this payoff matrix, so we assume that again we have two people, player 1 and player 2. We have two choices again, this time to cooperate or not. So that would be called defection. And we have this particular payoff matrix over here. And what's special for the so-called prisoner's dilemma is that you both get high payoffs if they cooperate. Both get low payoffs if they both don't cooperate. But if I cooperate and you don't, I get a very poor payoff, the so-called sucker's payoff, and you'll get a very high payoff, higher than R, the reward, called temptation. And that means there's a temptation not to cooperate, and there is a risk in cooperation. And that destabilizes the cooperative solution. That would be for sure better than if both don't cooperate, but this is exactly what's happening because the cooperative solution is unstable. So, you start cheating me, I don't like this, I stop cooperating, we would both end up in this poor payoff state, which is defining a tragedy of the commons. We end up in a situation that we don't like. Now, in principle, however, we could have a different ordering of these different payoffs in the matrix that we've seen before, right? So we had R, reward, T, temptation, S, sucker's payoff, and P, punishment. But now, if we don't give these interpretations to the parameters over here, but allow them to have any size, then we can have 4 different kinds of cases. I was just introducing you to the prisoner's dilemma, where cooperation is unstable, defection is stable, and therefore cooperation is never expected to resolve. However, there could be a harmony game, where cooperation is stable, defection is unstable, and therefore cooperation is always the result. We're coming to the second game that I mentioned in the beginning. So here, both cooperation and defection are stable, but the outcome depends on the initial condition. And finally, there is the snowdrift game, and you could call it also chicken game, where cooperation and defection are unstable, but a certain fraction of cooperation is stable. And the stability is given by eigenvalues, so we're again looking here at the replicator equation. The 2 eigenvalues, as you can see over here, and these eigenvalues are negative, then this implies stability of a stationary solution, otherwise you have instability. So it's very easy to read the behavior from this equation, both in terms of the stationary solutions by setting this to 0, and in terms of the stability of the corresponding stationary solution, which would imply whether you stay in the stationary solution or whether your system is driven away from it. Now, people are, of course, particularly interested in mechanisms that promote cooperation. And Martin Nowak has written a beautiful book about this, and other people too. I have already mentioned some of these mechanisms, such as genetic relatedness or genetic favoritism, repeated interaction or direct reciprocity, indirect reciprocity, reputation, also network clustering or competition between groups are mechanisms that people have been interested in, and in fact you can formalize this and you can do analytical calculation for many of these cases and see under what conditions these mechanisms would turn a social dilemma situation with the tragedy of the commons as an outcome into something that would create cooperation. And in many cases, these social mechanisms effectively change the payoff structure of the game. That means they change the game people play. Here is a slightly different case, which is particularly interesting, which has to do with migration. So, as I mentioned before, we've seen migration in the entire history of humankind, and many important and positive effects. So the question is why people are getting so terribly scared by migration these days. So what happened is that Martin Nowak and Robert May have actually started to simulate prisoner's dilemma games in 2 dimensions, assuming that people would just interact with their direct neighbors and not with everyone. If everyone interacts with everyone, we've seen with this replicator equation that you end up with defection, represented in red. So what is interesting here is that not everyone is shown in red. There are also some people shown in blue, and these cooperate. So basically, what we find here is that just the very fact that people interact with their neighbors rather than with everyone allows cooperation to survive. Things are getting even more interesting if we look into migration. And let's assume that people, for the time being, couldn't change their behavior, but they could change their location. We're starting with 2 kinds of behavior, red and blue. And in the beginning of my computer simulations, red and blue are equally distributed. So the same number of people of both behaviors in every single location. We have a 1-dimensional lattice, and people can either move to the left or to the right. And they would move to that neighboring location that would promise a higher payoff. And that payoff, of course, depends on the payoff matrix and on how many people are in there. And then we add a little bit of noise too. Now, the interesting point is that for most payoff matrices, you don't stay with the initial equal distribution. Instead, you find some pattern formation. That means you can either have segregation, as we see it over here, as in the lane formation of pedestrians. You could have agglomeration, but there are 2 types of agglomeration. Either the 2 behaviors are agglomerating in different places, or they're agglomerating the same kind of place. These are archetypes of behaviors that we find in many systems. These are cities, for example. These are segregation phenomena to different kinds. And the important point, as I said before, the equal distribution of behaviors is not stable, but rather you would find after some time in the parameter space, you would find basically a clustering, or and this will turn out to be terribly important. It's only in this red area where the equal distribution actually stays stable. So both for the prisoner's dilemma and for the snowdrift game, you find that for most parameter choices, there is pattern formation. And what implications does it have if we combine that with behavioral change? Now, in the Novak-May simulations of behavioral change in space, it has been assumed that people would imitate the behavior that earns more payoff. So if your most successful neighbor cooperates, you would start to cooperate too. If your most successful neighbor defects, you would defect too. So how is this actually influencing the outcome? So let's start with a situation where we have a 50-50 distribution of cooperation in blue and defection in red and some empty space because we need to allow for migration. Now, in the imitation-only case, you find the expected thing, that actually the level of cooperation is going down, people are defecting more. In the migration-only case, of course, the level of cooperation stays the same, but we find pattern formation. So cooperators tend to be next to cooperators, and that creates cooperative clusters, and defectors would try to get as close as possible to exploit the cooperative people. What happens if we combine these two mechanisms, none of which manage to increase the level of cooperation? Now, the interesting point is, this is creating an enormous increase of cooperation. So two mechanisms that haven't been successful in increasing cooperation in separation can create a very unexpected outcome together. And why is this happening? Well, this is what we call co-evolution. So basically, spatial organization and behavior co-evolve. And we find something that's well known actually from social milieu theory, that if your neighbors are cooperative, you tend to be cooperative too. You know, Heiko just talked about these kind of things. If your neighbors are cheating, you might start cheating too. So, importantly, however, migration, success-driven migration, that's limited to a certain radius around you, this success-driven migration allows you to run away from those people who exploit you, the defectors, and allows you to seek other cooperators to engage in beneficial cooperation. And that mechanism obviously creates high levels of cooperation. This is something that I personally didn't expect when I started to study. You know, it was more like a coincidence. I saw, okay, let's do some game theory, but I've done work on traffic and mobility before, so let's see what happens if we introduce mobility into game theory. And then people said, okay, but what if a defector now is being put in the middle of a cooperative cluster? Wouldn't that erode cooperation? And of course, such a thing could happen. So we've been looking into different kinds of noises. One kind of noise is kind of random flipping of behavior. So in a certain percentage of cases, people would do something just the opposite of what the model of May and Novel would actually imply. And as you can see over here, starting with almost everyone cooperating, we end up with almost everyone defecting. So noise is very destructive for cooperation in this setting. But here we just have imitation plus noise, no migration, okay? So let's look into a different scenario, which is migration and noise. And you see, it's bad too. Now people spread in space, but cooperation goes away too. And so the question is, if we now assume a scenario in which we have imitation of best performing neighbors plus success-driven migration in your direct neighborhood, plus those two destructive kinds of noise, which were very bad for cooperation, what would we get? And then I said to my PhD student at that time, let's start with everyone defective. That's kind of the state that Thomas Hobbes has assumed as the early stage of civilization, where everyone basically was fighting against everyone else. Homo hominis lupus. Everyone behaves like a wolf to everyone else. So let's assume this terrible situation where everyone is just badly behaved. And he said, we don't even need to simulate that because we will not find anything interesting. And 2 weeks later I came back, have you simulated this? And he said, no, because this is not interesting. And then eventually I sat next to him and said, now do it, like the classical method. And what happened after 5 minutes, there was this cluster of cooperators that occurred by coincidence, and once it was there, cooperation spread like mad in the entire system. So he was right for 5 minutes, and I was right for the rest of my life. So that means if your professor thinks you should do something, maybe you should not always resist. And this is not just happening when the professor sits next to you. This is happening all the time if you're just patient enough, So it can take a long time because we have to wait for this coincidence of sufficiently many people accidentally playing cooperation. But if you simulate hundreds or thousands of times, you see this is always happening. So it's really an important mechanism to promote cooperation, and we can be lucky that we have legs and can move, because otherwise it might not have happened this way. Now, of course, there are some critical colleagues who say, okay, well, isn't there something like a green beard effect in your migration mechanism? Green beard effect basically means that you can see beforehand whether somebody is cooperative or not. And in fact, in our success-driven migration implementation, we assume that people make virtual interactions in possible places they could move to, and if that looked promising, that means they would get high payoffs. They moved there, even though it could happen that they would get low payoffs once they have moved there. So I said, okay, I don't believe that we have a green beard effect, but that's simulated in a different way, where people actually don't know what strategies other people play, what behaviors they actually have, but you just have your own experience of how much payoff you got. You have some memory of the past, and we assume that people have certain kind of expectations how much payoff they would like to get. So there is a kind of a maximum payoff, a minimum payoff, and you say, okay, I expect to get at least, 40% of the difference here. So if I'm above this line, I'm happy, and I do the same thing, I stay in this place. If I fall below this line, I'm unhappy, and I think, something must change. Either I change my behavior, or I change my location, or both. But you don't know what the other person has really done. So this is the implementation. So you see, once you fall below the lines, then people would change position or strategy with a certain probability. And it turns out again, you find this formation of cooperative clusters, even though it's not as pronounced, and it creates an increase in the level of cooperation. And then people say, okay, but this is just a computer simulation. So we did an experiment in the lab. And no, this is actually a famous economist who said, no, it will never work. So what happened is we were collaborating on this with one of his closest collaborators these days, Charles Efferson, and he also didn't believe it would actually work. But now the paper is accepted for publication, and this is what we found. Now, without migration, we found the drop of initial cooperation as people had found it many times in the past, including Ernst Fehr. But with migration, apparently, there is a higher level of cooperation. So mobility can prevent a tragedy of the commons. And we can see that migration allows cooperators to avoid exploitation, and that migration allows cooperators to form cooperative neighborhoods. We also found that mobile cooperators seek smaller groups, but the most important message is mobility in these experiments is key to success.